Welcome to a new edition of the Indian Express Explained Live, our series of online explanatory conversations with domain experts and authorities on specific subjects. I am Monojit Majumdar, editor for explanatory journalism at the Indian Express. As some of you might be knowing, we have been doing these events for almost 6 years now. And I always begin with a few sentences about Explained itself, a section of the Indian Express that is very special to us. We think of Explained, that is the content in our paper and on our website, as well as in events such as this one, as being rooted in the news, but going beyond just the news. So it is context, it is background, it is connecting the dots, it is analysis. And in today's noisy news environment, an explanation of the news, why is something happening, what will happen from here on, how is it going to impact you, is perhaps as important as the news itself. This evening, we are talking about Afghanistan, specifically Taliban 2.0, the new rulers in Kabul. The Taliban, whom the United States spent 20 years and trillions of dollars to defeat, are back, perhaps stronger and more dominant than ever before. America has left in a fiasco, and the hollowness of its claim to global leadership stands exposed. For India, the immediate future in Afghanistan looks rather bleak. The government is currently focused on pulling out all Indians from the country as soon as possible, but it is not clear at this point how India proposes to deal with the Taliban in the coming weeks and months. To answer some of the questions around this situation, to explain how we got here and where we may be headed, and to analyze the choices that India has going forward, we have with us this evening Gautum Mukhopadhaya, the former ambassador of India to Afghanistan. Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, welcome to the Indian Express. Thank you for your time. We are honored to host you this evening. Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, you were in Afghanistan from 2010 to 2013 when Hamid Karzai was president. And much before that, you were in the unique position of being the man who reopened the Indian embassy in Kabul as charge d'affaires in November 2001 after the first Taliban government had been ousted by the US and NATO forces. You are also widely regarded as a thinking diplomat, someone who has over many years written and spoken on a range of subjects related to India and its neighborhood. Speaking to Ambassador Mukhopadhaya will be my colleague Nirupama Subramanian, national editor at the Indian Express. Nirupama, you are a veteran foreign policy and strategic affairs reporter and commentator who has lived and worked in Pakistan and continues to watch the region very closely indeed. Nirupama will be in conversation with Ambassador Mukhopadhaya for about 45 minutes, after which Ambassador Mukhopadhaya will take some questions from the audience for perhaps another half hour. Today's Explained event is brought to you by our associate partners, Yojana IAS and ICICI Bank. My thanks to our partners, and thank you all for joining us, and welcome once again. Nirupama.
Thank you so much, Monojit, for setting the stage for this conversation so nicely. I think we'll just jump into the conversation straight away. Gautam, with your permission, I will just speed walk the audience through the last 30 years of Afghanistan, which are relevant to today's discussion. So very quickly, I won't take too much of anybody's time. I will just start with 1979, when after a communist government seized power in a coup in Afghanistan, the USSR sent its thousands of its soldiers, the Red Army, to back up as backup for that government against a resistance that was building up, helped, of course, by Pakistan. It had become then the frontier of the Cold War, Afghanistan, and the US was jumped into the fray. And for 9 years, the Red Army was in Afghanistan, and and Mujahideen who were trained by the Pakistan Army, by the ISI, helped with funding from the United States, billions of dollars poured into the ISI's coffers to train and arm these Mujahideen, and they waged war against the Red Army. The Red Army was defeated and it pulled out after 9 years between 1988 and 1989. A coalition of Mujahideen forces came to power in Afghanistan, in Kabul. They took power in Kabul. They were fractious, they were fighting with each other, and that paved the way for the Taliban, which had been set up with Pakistan's help, came into existence with Pakistan's help. They walked into Kabul to charge Kabul. A northern alliance came up against the Taliban, headed by the Tajik leader Ahmad Shah Massoud, and they tried to fight against the Taliban, but they were no match, and they were eventually defeated. In 2001, when the Twin Tower bombing took place in the United States, America woke up to the reality that Al-Qaeda had been sheltered by the Taliban and invaded Afghanistan. And from then followed the next phase of the American forces in Afghanistan as part of Operation Enduring Freedom. And that 20 years has now ended. So in a sense, we have turned a complete full circle. The Taliban are back in Kabul, the Americans are out, and as Manojit said, it's a fiasco, and we are here to discuss how things will unfold from now on. So, Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, if I may ask you, let's start with a question that's that's a little current, and then we'll move on to the more substantive questions. What is the situation in Kabul right now? The Taliban have been in Kabul for more than a week now. They took power they walked into Kabul last Sunday, and they haven't yet announced what kind of government they're going to form, who's going to head the government. Why is the delay? Are they in negotiations? Can you throw some light on this?
Thank you very much, Monojit, and thank you very much, Nirupma, for inviting me to explain. It's a tremendous opportunity to speak at some length on the issues relating to Afghanistan instead of the 1-minute bites that we normally get on television. So thank you very much for that opportunity. After the kind of lightning military takeover of Afghanistan, the kind of almost blitzkrieg that took place, actually starting from the 15th of August, we are in a momentary pause, I would say, in the conflict, a pause that is actually characterized by a terrible humanitarian situation, scenes of desperation of Afghans wanting to leave Kabul and Afghanistan, heart-rending cases of a national level footballer and even a doctor hanging on to the wheels of an aircraft to get away. We've heard of stowaways in ships, but this is a kind of entirely new experience. We've heard of Afghan mothers throw babies over blast walls and barbed wires to American troops, effectively, or Western troops, in order to take them to at least give them a life of some freedom. In Kabul itself, the Taliban have come over. There has not been, a very large and very visible violence, but the Taliban are going from house to house, from office to office. There is a fair amount of looting, confiscation. People are being hunted, perhaps not on the scale that necessarily, catches the news, but an atmosphere of fear and loathing very much remains. Mullah Buradar is reported to have come into Kabul. On the other hand, we have seen that the Haqqani network, we saw scenes of Khalil Haqqani, the uncle of Sirajuddin and Anas Haqqani, in Kabul, even talking to crowds, attending Friday prayers. And so far, outside the sites, there are back-channel talks. Pakistan had invited a large number of ethnic leaders to Pakistan to try and talk or try to come up with a framework for some kind of inclusive transitional government. Inside Kabul, former chief executive Abdullah and ex-President Karzai and others have been reportedly in back-channel talks to try and see if they can cobble together a transitional government. Actually, so far, nothing has happened. And according to the news that I heard some time back, the Taliban have said that really there is nothing going to happen until the last American troops, leave. Meanwhile, the American evacuation is not complete. And there are pressures in the United States to perhaps extend the date of withdrawal for a little while so that the evacuation is complete. Of course, the United States and the Western allies are primarily concerned about their citizens and those who are very close to them. As far as the large majority of Afghans who want to leave are concerned, there are no flights operating. There are no commercial flights operating from Afghan airport. India's evacuation plans, flights, as far as I know, are more or less done. I don't know if there are any more planned, but we do know that some 200 to 300, I believe about 280 Afghan Sikhs and Hindus are still left behind in Kabul. And so I think there is a momentary pause. And this momentary pause, people are looking for some kind of patchwork solution for the time being, which will eventually lead to a longer-term arrangement.
Meanwhile, in this pause, we've also seen some people band together as a resistance to the Taliban, including the former vice president, let me call him the deposed vice president, Amrullah Saleh, Ahmad Shah Massoud's son, and some others who were said to be banding together to put up a fight in the Panchi Valley. Can you talk a little about the Panchi Valley and why it has always been important for this? I mean, even in the last Taliban regime, it was a center of resistance to the Taliban. So what is it about the Panchi Valley and how to take this resistance? Is it a serious resistance?
Right. So thank you very much for reminding me of that, Nirupama. So, there has been resistance, both spontaneous and clearly, with a long-term agenda in mind. The spontaneous resistance we have seen, extremely touching, defiant banner protests by women rejecting Taliban rule. Very interestingly, we have seen this phenomenon of flag protests. August 19th also happened to be the date of the 102nd anniversary, I think, of Afghan independence. And there were processions in Kabul, long processions with long flags, taking out the Afghan flag. Very interestingly, in places actually closer to Pakistan, in places like Kunar, Asadabad, Khost, and even Jalalabad, these flag protests have caught on. Very interestingly, these are all in so-called Pashtun areas. So I think one sign is that the resistance is not only going to be amongst the Panjsheris and amongst the Tajiks and possibly other ethnic groups, but there is a distaste and, in fact, an opposition to Taliban rule even among the Pashtuns, who constitute for a long time the majority of the Taliban. In the Panjsher and beyond, we did have a kind of effort at resistance in Herat by Ismail Khan, in Balkh and in Mazar area by General Dostum and Atanur. These actually, were aborted, actually partly because of the swiftness of the surrender and whispered instructions that seem to have gone to units there, including army units, not to fight because a deal apparently was imminent or in the making. Panjsher's importance is this: that it's nestled in a valley with a very protected entrance, and it's a very good place to be able to prevent large-scale ingress and a large-scale kind of intrusion. So it's a kind of little fortress surrounded by mountains. But Panjsher by itself is not adequate because Panjsher is also below, in other words, south of the Salang Pass. And you have to traverse the Salang Pass and eventually come out at a place called Pule Khumri. And for Ahmad Shah Massoud, a kind of rear channel through the effectively what was Kunduz, Pule Khumri, and also Badakhshan to some extent, was very necessary for their rear bases, which then were in Tajikistan. So this time, to some extent, as of now, the Panjsheris do not have that access. But in the last 2-3 days, we have also seen reports of popular uprisings supported by youth of the army in 3 districts of, I think it was Pule Khumri itself, which have been retaken from the Taliban. We don't know how long it will last, given the overwhelming, preponderance and the numerical weight against them. But these are the first signs of resistance. Remember, actually, one of the reasons why, by and large, the Afghans caved into the Taliban is just simply fatigue with war, fatigue with terrorism, a kind of resignation that had set in, a kind of complete disconnect with the government, a sense of powerlessness that decisions regarding Afghanistan are not made by them. They are made by outsiders, foreigners, and they're also made by their own leaders who are playing their own games. So there was a sense that the people simply didn't have a connect either with the government or with the foreign forces. And therefore, when they saw the Taliban, and the Taliban, over a period of time, there was a massive propaganda war, information warfare, kind of psychological warfare that was taking place from behind, conveying an image of invincibility and inevitability. And so in response to that, and seeing that the Afghan forces were not really putting up a fight, the large majority did what Afghans generally do in the face of an Afghan rival, accept the turn of the tide and, discretion being the better part of valor, maybe live to fight another day, accept tactical peace or a resigned peace for the time being. And the whole country is in a state of shock because nobody really expected the Americans to actually withdraw, even though the Americans were very clear about what they were going to do. At some point, there's a kind of psychological denial that sets in, which I witnessed, for example, when the Soviet Union broke down. We did not believe that the Soviet Union would collapse and dismantle. So I think there is that kind of psychological dependence and psychological denial that had also set in, and a state of shock. So even in the state of shock, we see, sparks of rebellion and resistance. And we have to watch and see if the Taliban actually act as they have been messaging, conveying a sense of amnesty and responsibility. On the ground, this is not visible. On the ground, people are walking about with lists. People have been identified as being pro or anti them. I think there are fears about people who have been closely associated with India as well. So far, there has been no large-scale witch hunt, though there was in Spin Boldak and there has been in Jalalabad and Kandahar against journalists. But I think the main point here is that the images coming out of Afghanistan are really mostly curated images being put out by the Taliban itself. There's very little presence of international media. There is very little ground level reporting. Even social media is not yet coming out too much. And we hear that in parts of the South, there is virtually an information blackout. So we actually don't know, but there are reports of looting in the countryside, pretty much old style, spoils of war kind of looting. So I think, there is a lot to be learned. In the meantime, there is also a cash shortage. People cannot get to the airport. People cannot get cash. There's a huge humanitarian disaster. About 300 to 400,000 people had come in from the north to Kabul before Kabul itself fell. There is a need to, find provisions for their day-to-day life, as they basically have been sleeping on the streets. And really what we have is a humanitarian potential disaster there, which in the midst of all this needs to be tackled. And I'll add one more point, Nirupama. The Taliban have leveraged these dependencies very well. For example, when they took over the customs points and the border points, in a way, they forced the countries on the other side to, for practical reasons, to deal with them and acquire legitimacy. In blocking the road to the airport, they have forced all those who are in Kabul to actually negotiate with them. And in the same way, what we are seeing now is, possibly an attempt to essentially leverage their power or their presence on the ground to be able to, to force the international community also to deal with them. And that will also apply to the humanitarian issue.
Correct. So there are lots of themes in what you just said. One is, of course, the question of legitimacy. The other is the question of the US withdrawal. And the third, which I'll come to the third first, which is about, you talked about the flag. And it is often, it has been argued in the last few days, in the last 10 days, that, Afghanistan is incompatible. I mean, democracy and Afghanistan are incompatible because the place just doesn't work like that. It works on tribal affiliations, tribal loyalties, or ethnic affiliations. It is not a place where democracy will ever succeed. And of course, the Taliban have said that they will not, they're not interested in a democracy. They're not going to, that was their stand from the beginning, that they're never going to stand for elections. So is that right? Would you agree with this, that, the US, although President Joe Biden has denied that there was a nation-building project, they did pour in billions of dollars into this exercise of elections of presidents, elections of parliament, all that. So that was basically a democracy exercise. What else was it? But was it all futile? Would you say that, given this, did the world and the US and all of us just not see through this thing that, this is not a country for democracy, that this is not the way the country works?
Right. Thank you, Nirupama. Excellent set of questions. So I'm going to disentangle them into three strands. The first is the strand on the Afghan flag, which is really a question of Afghan national identity. The second is the strand on democracy. And third is the strand on, the so-called blood and treasure that the United States and West has invested in it. On the flag, I have to say this, that, the Taliban, whatever, evolution or changes they may have taken place, we cannot forget the Taliban has been a 100% Pakistani project that started in 1994 and is now 27 years old, and got a twist, or you can call a mutation, after they were defeated in 2001 and went to Pakistan in 2002. They were picked up and groomed and nourished in the in the madrasas associated with the refugee camps in Pakistan that were essentially run by a whole spate of, we can call them, kind of extreme Deobandi or Wahhabi kind of mullahs, hundreds of madrasas in that region. So you can imagine that somebody, let's say at the age of 5 or 6 or 10, they would have had another 26, 27 years. They would still be in the fighting age. They may have started with older, students, and over a period of time picked up many more. These students also provided the pool for the suicide bombers. For every one suicide bomber that who may have actually blown themselves up, you can imagine the number, the support group. Starting from the recruitment, from the training, from the brainwashing, to the logistics of their departure, the arms, and just you can imagine all that. So what was the point? What was the Pakistani agenda in the Taliban? The Pakistani agenda in forming the Taliban was to create a kind of constituency of Afghans that were effectively, they were to erase the Afghan and Pashtun identity of those people who had grown up in the refugee camps, and submerge it in a much larger pan-Islamic identity under the Emirate, or sometimes also the Caliphate. So that when it comes to a choice between Afghanistan and the Taliban have opted, Afghanistan and the Emirate. The Taliban have opted for the Emirate. If they really had Afghanistan in their hearts, then there was an opportunity, however flawed an opportunity, however weak the two sides may have been. In fact, they had the advantage with the help of the Americans in having the decks stacked totally in their favor. They could have made peace with fellow Afghans. But in fact, theirs was a war against other Afghans who did not think like them, who did not accept an Emirate, and who still thought in terms of an Afghan national identity. So the flag protests in many ways symbolize that. The second question was about democracy. Now, democracy is a loaded word. And, if you use democracy a lot, then people think, okay, the West is imposing democracy. There is no such thing as democracy in Afghanistan. And you mentioned all the features of democracy. But in fact, actually, democracy is also a code word for coexistence and freedom and rights. So it is not the form of democracy that matters, but it's the free spirit of freedom and the spirit of rights that is actually enshrined in the democratic project. And the Afghans have shown over the last 20 years that they are second to none in wanting freedom and wanting those rights. If I can just give you one metric, there are several metrics in terms of whether this money that has been spent has been wasted. In the last 40 years, the last 20 years have been the only period when there has not been net export of refugees from Afghanistan. In fact, expatriates came back and a new generation grew up, a new generation that saw terrorism but did not actually see fighting and war. This is very significant. This is quite apart from many other human development indices, education, girls' education, maternal mortality, media, the growth of the media, the spread of communications technology and even smartphones. There were many, many other metrics of what you would call development. So I would not say that it was a bit sad that even somebody like Obama actually said that, democracy is not for Afghanistan. But when you say democracy is not for Afghanistan, you are actually saying that freedom and rights for women and rights for minorities, just the basic freedoms that we all are used to and actually rebel against if it is challenged. So the Afghans want that, and in fact, behind the malgovernance, the misgovernance, the predatory governments of the Afghan government, and also behind many ways a lot of misrepresentations of the US and Western presence. The fact is that they gave Afghan people a taste of freedom and relative peace, I would say, over the last. They faced daily terrorism, but at least there was not the kind of civil war that we had seen in the past. And that is why women are, sending their children out to the US bases to get them out of the country. So I hope I've answered your question on this.
So just to pick up on what you said, where did then the US fail so badly that, it was forced into making a deal for an exit with the Taliban? From President Trump's time, they were in negotiations for this deal, and it was concluded last year in Doha. And then we saw this humiliating sort of withdrawal from Afghanistan last week, and the continuing evacuation, of course. So where did the US actually go wrong? If all this was working so fine, and people are happy with what was on the ground, what the freedoms that were available to them, the progress that was made over the last 20 years in so many ways, where was the failure then?
Right. So actually the failure was right from the beginning. The failure was in the reason function. The Americans never made two bones about it. They were very clear that they intervened to eliminate Al-Qaeda and international terrorism. They didn't say that they were there to liberate the Afghans from the Taliban. So to that extent, you have to be fair to them. But this operation, cleaning up Al-Qaeda, took them 10 years to even find Osama bin Laden and actually reach some stage where you could theoretically say that Al-Qaeda is eliminated. But second, they also came face to face with the reality that Al-Qaeda came out of something, or the Al-Qaeda's presence there came out of something, came out of the growth of radicalism that had been promoted and exported from Pakistan. So in fact, at the same time, they ran into the Iraq war. And in the second phase, what they effectively did was, from the lessons that they learned from the Iraq war, they entered a second stage of the, so to say, US military presence in Afghanistan, which was a counterinsurgency operation. So from counterterrorism, they came to counterinsurgency. This was around the time that President Obama came to power. In fact, during his campaign trail, his logic was that Iraq is a war of choice. Afghanistan is a war of necessity. In Afghanistan, the theater of the war is in Afghanistan, but the locus, the source, the origin of the war is in Pakistan. And that is why he came up with the mandate for Richard Holbrooke, the AFPAC mandate. Now, as usual, Bush also had realized that Pakistan is the root cause of the problem. Obama realized this. President Trump, in his South Asia strategy of August 2017, came to the same conclusion. He specifically named and very strongly named Pakistan. But for some reason, none of the American administrations were able to pursue. Their military commanders, their defense secretaries knew that, but they were not able to pursue the logic of that, so to say, a discovery to its final conclusion by the use of coercive diplomacy, something that President Karzai had been pleading for years with the Americans. Why are you fighting in Afghanistan? The war is actually starting from Pakistan, which they failed to completely follow the logic of that. But apart from that, US spent money, and they spent money in the war effort, and they spent some money on media and civil society and women and many other things. But they did not invest in Afghanistan. They knew that Afghanistan was sitting in $3 trillion worth of mineral wealth. There was not a single investment in Afghanistan's mineral wealth. If countries, and actually India tried at one stage to do that intentionally, with the view that from the mineral wealth, the government would actually earn revenues to be able to sustain state building and have the revenues for state building. They did not invest even in democracy. They did not invest in the institutions of democracy. They invested in a few civil society institutions. They did not invest in trade. If, for example, they had wanted to invest in trade, they should have pushed Pakistan, particularly during the Holbrooke Mandate, to open two-way transit trade between India, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, meaning from India to Afghanistan through Pakistan, which the Pakistanis have all along ruled against. So it's one-way transit trade, not two-way transit trade. So that's why we had to take recourse to air corridors, air freight corridors, and Chabahar, and other modalities. So actually, in no way did they really invest. They spent a lot of money. That money went into a gravy train of a large number of both US contractors and Afghan contractors, opportunists, power brokers. Everybody a certain group of people made money out of it, but money did not reach the people. In fact, it enriched those people to become even more predatory in their governance style. So I would actually say that the problem really began from there. But after that, it was compounded by any number of things. But I think I'll just come to one major point there, is that around 2018, when the Trump administration first reached out for direct negotiations with the Taliban, I think they came to the realization, there's a benign explanation and there's a malicious explanation for this. They came to the realization that after 20 years of the war on terror, they effectively provided net security for their major strategic rivals, China, Russia, and Iran in the region. And they did not. And the reason for that was, and it was also implicit in my previous remarks, that they never thought of Afghanistan in terms of its strategic importance, the way the rest of the region does when we talk about the heart of Asia and so on. And because of that, they did not look for actually they wasted opportunities. If you're thinking in terms of an American kind of strategic thinking, they wasted opportunities that they could have used in the region, both for the development of Afghanistan as well as for greater stabilization of the region. But and so effectively they said, all right, we are pulling out. This government is corrupt, etc. We are pulling out, and now your security from the Taliban, or whether there's a civil war or whatever it is your headache. It's your problem. The problem with this is that it places everyone, the Central Asian republics, India, the Afghans themselves, most of all, as purely collateral damage. The malicious interpretation of this is that the Americans deliberately actually facilitated the return of the Taliban to destabilize the region for their strategic rivals. So I think, sorry?
To contain China? Is that the interpretation?
Yeah, I think basically to keep everyone off balance. You see, on the face of it, it is quite baffling that the United States should try to contain China everywhere, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, but give them a virtual strategic pass in Central Asia. And for a long time, I was quite puzzled by why this is happening. But, I'm just hypothesizing here. the possibility is that, in fact, they were not giving them a strategic pass. They were trying to lure them, just as they lured the Soviets into Afghanistan at an earlier level. In other words, a new bear trap, this time for the Chinese.
You spoke about the other powers in the region, Russia, China, Iran, the Central Asian republics. They're not powers, of course, but they're all interested countries. And in a way, all of these countries seem to have colluded to bring the Taliban back in Kabul, along with Pakistan. So would you like to speak a little about what their role has been?
Sure. Yes. I think as far as the Russians were concerned, they were avenging their humiliation for 1989. As far as the Iranians were concerned, actually the Iranians knew and that they were benefiting from the United States' presence, because effectively they were taking care of the Taliban for them. And, they were part of the coalition against the Taliban in the 5 years of Taliban 1.0. So these were sort of the principal reasons. Iran, for example, has, of course, issues along the border, drugs, migration, refugees, and so on. So they rationalize it by saying that, there are compulsions for tactical and for pragmatic reasons. They need to deal with the Taliban. But we actually also know that they were cultivating a group within the Taliban that they could, use on a future occasion. And they were also using this group to harass the United States as and when it was necessary. And at various stages.
So in a sense, while they were getting that security from the US presence, these were countries that also wanted to see the US defeated, because they had their own their own issues with the United States. Yeah.
I think their primary motivation was that. A secondary motivation was some practical arrangements on their frontiers, one form or the other. But now, they're going to have to face the reality of the Taliban. And, they've all tried to make the same deals, which is to say, if you take care of our security, we will not, bother you. But there is the nature of this, of the Taliban, which, in fact, we talk about the Taliban, but a very large number of regional extremist outfits are deeply enmeshed with them. And it's going to be very difficult to separate them. Just as it's going to be very difficult to separate the Al-Qaeda from the Taliban and expect Taliban to act against Al-Qaeda as was contained in the US-Taliban deal, I think the Russians will realize in due course that the Taliban do not even have the capability, even if they had the desire, to be able to control, groups like the IMU, the movement of Uzbekistan, the Hizb ut-Tahrir in Tajikistan, even the ETIM for China, but also the IS for Russia, which is their principal concern. So I think, they have taken a gamble. Now they will have to see whether their gamble works or not.
But in some ways, the first effects of all this hotbed of militancy that Afghanistan is, and maybe will become more increasingly, will be felt in Pakistan, because Pakistan is the one where they don't, where the Pashtuns don't recognize that border. They don't recognize the Durand line as the border of that country. And there's a lot of coming and going. I mean, you saw that even while the US were in Afghanistan, the Taliban were, of course, sitting in Quetta, they're sitting in Peshawar. So there's been a lot of coming and going, and this coming and going may in fact turn into,
back on them.
Worse color for Pakistan. So, could you talk a little bit more about that relationship that Pakistan has had, its militant groups? What are the militant groups that are based in Pakistan, which are actually in Afghanistan, and how that might affect Pakistan itself in the long run? At this moment, I think Pakistan is savoring a victory of sorts, because it has its friend in Kabul, which it has always wanted for so many years. But is this going to be something bigger than it chew? Has it bitten off something bigger than it can chew?
Right.
And what is the Taliban itself? Can it hope to control the Taliban itself in the long term, as it hopes for?
Right. Yeah. So, in thinking circles, and I think, General Bajwa has said something, and I'd like to believe that he believes that and is serious. There is concern that there's going to be blowback of the Taliban. In fact, one of the first actions that the Taliban took was that they opened up all the jails and released all the prisoners. And among the prisoners are TTP, who have now, heading back to the Pashtun areas of Pakistan. So there definitely will be some blowback. But in the general population, even in the establishment, actually, that is secondary. At this moment, they are exulting in their victory and their sense that, they have won. They claim that they have won against India, and they have won against the United States. So I think that victory feeling is there. Among the Pashtuns also, it's very interesting. The Pashtun Tahaffuz movement has all along supported the elected government in Afghanistan. And even after the fall of Kabul, Mohsin Davar, who's a leader of the PTM, and other people from the old ANP, people like Afrasiab, Khatak, and so on, have opposed the Taliban invasion of Afghanistan. But there are two aspects that we should bear in mind here. One is that already Pakistan is beginning to use the prospects of a TTP blowback as part of
Taliban Pakistan.
Their Taliban blowback, as once again playing the victim card. Look, we are the victims of this, and we have nothing to do with this. This is the Afghans who have nourished this particular group, and now they have been let loose, and so on. And the second thing is this: that even if they come to that realization that they may be blowback, it doesn't change the Pakistani calculus, which is to primarily keep us out, keep India out of Afghanistan. In fact, I would say that their larger objective, to which now they use the term, for which they now use the term geoeconomics, their larger objective is to try and sever Afghanistan's relations with India, and in fact reorient them, kind of geo-engineer them towards Central Asia and China. And that is why this whole, oddly enough, the Americans have in some ways, at least symbolically, signed up onto that with their Central Asian Quad, connectivity quad with Uzbekistan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the United States. Of course, I don't think they're serious about that. I think it's just a little bit of wool before the eyes, because there's no way they can compete with China in connectivity in Central Asia. And in any case, the irony is that they would actually be connecting to the CPEC outlets through Pakistan. So the long and short is that for Pakistan, there are two things. Their interests in Afghanistan have to do with externalizing the Pashtun problem, so that a strong and united Afghanistan, and particularly a strong and united Pashtuns amongst them, do not reopen the issue of the Durand Line. And their second reason is to keep India out. And if they cannot actually get a regime that is literally a kind of under their tutelage, they have an interest in keeping Afghanistan unstable through one of several partners that they may have, one of several sort of horses that they may have in the race, to keep Afghanistan boiling, so that the Pashtun problem does not come back to bite them. So I think this is the general sort of outline that explains Pakistan's strategy. And it doesn't end with Afghanistan, because this whole idea of the emirate is an umbrella for many other groups. When we talk about, I think I referred to so-called all this talk about Afghan being nationalists. The reality is that the Taliban have made deals with the occupiers, who they call the occupiers, the United States, for their withdrawal. They've made deals with Iran, Russia, China. They've used Pakistani territory against Afghans. And if you think that there's going to be limited to Afghanistan, the idea of an emirate blurs those boundaries and could be stretched far beyond Afghanistan as well. Not necessarily by them, but by their partners.
Right. So, you spoke about how one of Pakistan's objectives in all this was to leave India out. But why did India choose to get left out? What could have India done not to be left out? Why didn't, the question is often asked that we should have open talks to the Taliban as well when it became clear that the Americans were talking to them. Why did we not do that? Should we have done it at all? I mean, there are two schools of thought about it, and I'd be interested to know, as would the audience, about, did we do the right thing by not opening
channels
with them?
So this is a controversial issue. I get asked this a lot. I think India did right in perhaps making discrete behind-the-scenes contacts, which it hasn't publicly acknowledged. It has said that it's in touch with all stakeholders, but it's very likely that they had behind-the-scene contacts with some parts, some elements, maybe some individuals or a faction of the Taliban. And I think that outreach was probably merited. The whole issue of talking to the Taliban had two issues. One is that the Afghan people and Afghan government were definitely not so if you had talked to the Taliban, there are two ways of talking. One is that you talk to the Taliban in the context of the peace process. So the overtures that we made to the Taliban were in the context of the peace process when we were represented at the Doha talks, and particularly when the intra-Afghan talks started. So I think talking in the context of an intra-Afghan peace process was very much something that was both legitimate and something that the Afghans wanted. But talking to do a deal behind them, as every other country had done, was going to repeat the mistakes that every other country did, which is to betray the Afghan people who oppose the Taliban, who actually constitute the majority of Afghanistan, for your own selfish interests. And, your selfish interests are enmeshed with the interests of your allies. You cannot just substitute the Taliban for the generation that you have educated or helped educate and nourished and supported for the last 25 years. So if you think, or if people think that by talking to the Taliban or by engaging the Taliban, and particularly a lot of people insist that it should have been in public, that you would actually win a strategic friend against Pakistan, I think we are deluding ourselves. This is a 27-year relationship. Even if a lot of the Taliban dislike and hate the Pakistanis, those are sentimental, reflections. There's not much they can do about it. They are very tightly in the clutch of the Pakistanis. But more importantly, you would have conferred the last country with whom perhaps the most important traditional partner, historical partner of Afghanistan, would have conferred legitimacy on the Taliban. And in the process, betrayed that generation that we are talking about, that we call post-born or democratic, or, we can say, who wanted the freedoms of that. So I think we were right in not doing that. The back channel connections do exist. I think they were exercised in the course of the evacuation, so that we were able to get to the airport and so on. And I also think that the time to use that card will come now. Now we have to see what kind of government they make, whether it is transitional, whether it is inclusive. Once they are in power in Kabul, we will see if the factions have their frictions. We will see who is willing to reach out to us, who can reach out to us, whether Pakistan's control over them, the ISI's control of them can be diluted. The time to play that game is now. If you tried to do that earlier, you would have had no guarantee. Even if you had struck a deal with one faction, what guarantee is, just say even of the security of your embassy, what guarantee is it that the ISI would not set, say, the Haqqani network to attack you? And could any of those factions give us a guarantee that that would not happen? It would not happen. And I think that was the main reason.
You mentioned
what is the game?
That now is the time to play that game. So what is the game that we could play now in Afghanistan? I mean, why are we calling it a game also? And what is the leverage that we can expect to bring by exploiting, say, differences between various factions in the government? And
in the government, not yet.
In the government to be if and when it is set up. So what is it that we hope to achieve with all this? What is our role going to be in Afghanistan?
Right.
Is it going to be,
so
I mean,
game
are we going to end up becoming a spoiler for this, of this setup? That could be a question.
No, fair question.
Yeah.
Absolutely fair question. So when I say game, of course, I mean it as a figure of speech. I don't mean it as, the great game or some kind of spy games or, spy versus spy kind of games and all that. So the game could be simply this, let's say it's the reality, Taliban in power, they're most likely to, monopolize all power. But perhaps it would be in our interest, and, I'm saying this a little hesitantly, it would be in our interest to at least keep open some minimal level of engagement. Of course, the Taliban will try to gain that for a higher level of engagement, but to keep a minimal level to at least people-to-people relationship going. And also to the extent that other than Pakistan, there may be other parts of the international community, perhaps, if particularly since we happen to be in the United Nations, we also happen to be the chair of the sanctions committee. There are various, and the fact that we have a constituency amongst the Afghan people, that the immediate need is a pause to the war, a humanitarian effort, allow people to leave, and then perhaps start working, if they are serious, on some kind of transitional arrangement, if the international community, gives us a chance, and if the Afghans insist that we are there, and then, gradually work on that. So I think the first thing that we could try to do is to try to see if we can actually bring about an inclusive government and have some kind of, let's call it temporary phase of peace. But the second possibility is this, that what if the Afghan people rise up against the Taliban? I think we should also keep the alternative. We are not necessarily talking about active involvement right now, but essentially we should keep the alternative of a democratic Afghanistan alive in some form or the other. And by this I mean all those people who would like to have a government that is more representative of the people and of their sentiments of Afghanistan. One important point, a lot of people think that somehow Taliban are supported by the majority of Afghans. That is not the case. Islamic political formations and parties have been around in Afghanistan since the time of Zahir Shah. You have the Jamiat, you have the Hizb-e-Islami, you have any number of, factional leaders, old Mujahideen leaders who were all Islamists. The government of Afghanistan calls itself an Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. So Islam is very much part and parcel of the fabric and the political formations of the Afghanistan. But there is no Taliban political formation. And actually, that's a very strong hint that, in fact, it is an alien phenomenon, not a genuine phenomenon. They may have triumphed right now, but they do not have roots in the people. They may have been, accepted for the moment because they were, they were a relief, let's say, from the predatory governance of the past. But I think that idea of keeping alive an alternative should remain. And therefore, we should provide assistance and address temporary, maybe asylum, open our doors for those who, want to escape Afghanistan, not shut our borders. We are not talking about refugees here. We're only talking about visas, temporary visas, maybe even transit visas for people to go elsewhere. We are talking about, people coming and studying in India, medical assistance, maybe relocating media houses that cannot function anymore, think tanks, scholars. There's a range of things that we can do, which are very soft, which are not hard. But I don't think we should be embarrassed about supporting freedom either.
So before we open this session to the floor, one last question. So are you suggesting that we recognize a kind of government in exile, or the Vice President Amrullah Saleh has said that he is the acting president now that there's no president. So under the Constitution, this is what it is. Should we recognize him as a leader? Are you saying that?
Well, I'm not going so far as that. At the moment, in fact, there is no other government.
Yeah.
The government may have collapsed. There is no alternative government. Somebody has taken over the capital. This was like when the Northern Alliance took over Kabul. When I first went to Afghanistan, there was no government. They just took over. But after that, you had the Bonn Conference, and the Bonn Conference decided on a kind of interim presidency that then, was formalized in some form by the Afghans themselves. And then that led to that kind of constitution making process until finally you adopted a constitution in 2004 and had an elected government. So actually, we are talking about, right now, even the United States is represented by the government of the Islamic Republic of, the United Nations. The representation of Afghanistan is the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. So I don't even think that issue should come up. They remain the government, at least until there is an international acceptance of change. And only then, after we see what we are seeing, will the issue of recognizing another government come up.
Right. Thank you, Gautam. I think now we have spoken actually well past our 45 minutes. We have taken 55 minutes. Okay. So we should now open it up for questions.
Yes, good evening.
Good evening.
Yeah, ask your question.
Yeah, I just wanted to know that do Talibanis care for their mother and sisters? I mean, it has been seen that the females are always neglected by them. I mean, maybe they are considered as a factory of producing children only. So do they really care for their female, mother, their family person?
Very tough question, Zareen. I honestly don't feel competent to answer that. It would be unnatural for them not to. But the fact is that that during this phase, they have been abducting and forcing marriages on lots of women. They've been collecting lists of women of an age of reproductive age. Actually, in many ways, the scale of atrocities that the Taliban have done in this year alone, and I'm speaking objectively, and I'm not trying to be anti-Taliban here, attacks on maternity hospital, attacks on girls' schools, attacks on minority institutions and minorities in general. In the case of Hazaras, raising the allegations of a possible genocide, targeted attacks against media, civil society, including an Indian journalist, brutalization of an Indian journalist, and of course, most recently forward these forced marriages and abductions. In effect, these were the things that the ISIS was doing in Iraq and Syria, and they were bombed for that. Instead, in the case of the Taliban, simply because the West wants to make an exit and needs something in its place, the Taliban is being legitimized and is being acknowledged and received in some of the chancelleries of the world. So I would say they are definitely extremely misogynist. Many of them have grown up in madrasas without, any feminine companionship. But beyond that, I think there are people who have specialized in the Taliban, who lived and worked amongst them. And I would actually refer to one book which has completely gone out of print and circulation by a person called Sultan Shaheen. It was Inside the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan. This book was around 2011-12. Sultan Shaheen was disappeared. He was murdered under mysterious circumstances soon after the publication of that book. But it gives a very good insight because he actually worked. He was not as polished in his writing as Ahmed Rashid or anyone else, but he actually lived and worked amongst Taliban fighters and their commanders. So he had a very good insight into their worldview. If you can get a copy of that, I would urge our readers to have a look at it, because it's much more than Western accounts. It gives an insight into the Taliban. Most of the Western accounts have actually ended up becoming a little bit of an apologism for the Taliban. There's a little bit of romanticism also involved in that.
Sir, I wanted to, pick your brains on, you did at least 2 tours or 3 tours of Afghanistan during your career?
No, I did, frankly, the first tour I can't say was a tour because it was about 5-6 months in the initial months. Before Mr. Vivek to ambassador and he represented his credentials. But just biographically, through Afghanistan as a student, along with two companions in 1977. So I have, before the Soviet invasion and before the destruction of the intra-Mujahideen destruction and the Taliban repression. So I have some distinctions as well as after my retirement.
Right. So I wanted to get a sense from you. You know, we've talked about whether India should have engaged with the Taliban openly or not. You've made your views clear. But from a historical context, when you were there as the ambassador or you interacted with the locals there, did you get the opportunity to interact with people who were, if not directly Taliban members of the Taliban movement, but who were sympathizers or supporters? And, and also we hear a lot of cadets, Afghan army cadets who came to India and then they went back. And some of them apparently joined the movement as well in the later years, in the later stages. So there is a commentary, there's a thought process that India should possibly engage with those students, those cadets, to reach out to the Taliban 2.0. Do you think there is a merit in that idea? Yeah. And how were your interactions with the Taliban, if not members, supporters, sympathizers? That is one question. The second thing I wanted to ask you was, do you think there is a possibility of cooperating with Pakistan when it comes to this new situation in Afghanistan? Because what it seems to me in Kabul was that, Pakistan is enjoying the victory right now, and India has been, is not in the game, so to say, in Kabul. As of now, it may crawl back, but right now it's not in the game. So do you think there's a possibility to cooperate with Pakistan as well? So these two questions.
Yeah. So, this, once again, to come back to the question of engaging the Taliban, a lot of people say that, and, that is diplomacy 1.0, that you talk to your, enemies, or you talk to your, those who are fighting and so on. But nobody actually addresses the question of what you could expect that you would get for it. What would you get in return? Do you think by sacrificing a bird in your hand, which is the new generation of Afghanistan, you would have got two in the Pakistani bush? Typically, nobody addresses that question. So that was another reason why I do not entirely support that logic that we should have engaged them earlier. As far as the retired Taliban, I call them retired Taliban because they were Taliban 1.0 who came back to Afghanistan. By the way, we know from intelligence reports and intelligence things that President Karzai was engaged in back channel, actually through tribal channels, talks with Mullah Baradar at a time when the Taliban was still relatively weak. There were elements in the Taliban, in fact, perhaps even blessed by Mullah Umar, who wanted to come back to Afghanistan. But that time, the international situation, both the political, the war on terror, the rhetoric was still very high. The Northern Alliance was extremely suspicious of them. There was a lot of this ethnic business that, in fact, this is going to pad up the Pashtuns in the power structure. So there were many other reasons why that did not happen. But some of those people, like you all very well know, Mullah Zaif, but I'll also mention, for example, there was a very colorful and in some ways notorious Taliban commander called Mullah Rockety. And Mullah Rockety had been in jail. And I actually met a French yoga teacher who persuaded Mullah Rockety to do yoga. And in fact, Mullah Rockety became a great enthusiast of yoga. This is apocryphal perhaps, but at least this has been reported to me. But there were others. And essentially, they were sympathetic to the Taliban. But what they accepted was that there is possibility for coexistence. If the Taliban accept the idea that they can coexist with those who are opposed to the emirate, that means they can, if the Republican idea can coexist with the emirate, the idea of the emirates, then there is no difficulty. In fact, it is much better for India that they are brought into the power structure and Afghanistan is once again united. Gradually, in effect, the Taliban will get weaned. They will become more Afghanized. As I said, the whole attempt has been to erase their Afghan identity. and there would be a much better chance of peace. So, we are not anti-Taliban in that sense, but it's the anti-Taliban in terms of their practices and also the control that we are talking about. Exactly, that's it. And but I feel that the idea of the emirate is exclusive. The idea of the emirate is exclusive. It's one of the Taliban leaders, somebody you are probably thinking of when you made one of your comments, actually said in a closed door briefing that he was asked the question, will your jihad end when the US troops leave? And his answer was that the jihad will end when every last vestige of foreign influence leaves. And by every last vestige, they mean women, they mean freedoms, they mean minorities. And let me also, push something deeper. Even if they get the ethnic leaders on board in a transitional arrangement, will they actually share power with them? Because if they share power with them, in fact, they will be actually supporting the alternative to the emirate. Because let's say the Hazaras are not at all invested in the idea of the emirate. Most of the Tajiks are not, even though they've been trying to radicalize the Tajiks and the Uzbeks for a long time, and they have succeeded to some extent. But what will actually happen is that they will discredit those ethnic leaders in the process, and they will create a reaction against them. And that reaction against them will be an opportunity to radicalize. They've already done that with a large number of the Pashtuns, but they will radicalize also the Uzbeks and the Tajiks in the process. So I think that is a deeper game plan. It's, of course, speculative right now, conjecture, but I think these are things that we have to be wary of. At least we should be aware that these could happen. Thank you.
He had another question on India and
on those 2 points about whether we can tap into this former Afghan army cadets who are possibly now part of the Taliban movement.
Yes, why not? Why not? I mean, anyone who's willing to talk to us, we should be willing to talk to them. That doesn't mean that we accept their ideology.
And exactly. Particularly.
But what we should also be careful is that we don't do deals with them at the expense of our partners for the last 25 years. I think that would be political harakiri.
And what about possibility of cooperating with Pakistan on
good question.
with the Taliban?
I think as of now, it seems very difficult given the overall state of our relations. But also, I think the Pakistani obsession with keeping India out, I think the interests are completely contrary. When things were better, much better, even at the time that I was ambassador there from 10 to 13, the Pakistanis would often make the point that you should talk to us about Afghanistan. We would say we are ready, but they would never actually take it up. And we've been in several track 2 dialogues where this issue came up. But in fact, the Pakistanis never actually picked up the offer. If you remember, we went to the extent at one stage of even being willing to talk about Balochistan. So the willingness to talk about, hot issues has not been absent from our part, but they have not actually done so. They were only interested in point scoring.
My question is on a slightly different track. Is it not time to completely overhaul our policy towards Afghanistan? Yes, enemy is your friend is a very good proposition, but it appears that India-Afghanistan relationship is actually a one-way street, with Afghanistan getting most of the benefits and India not getting anything substantial in return. In any case, we have been backing up the wrong horses in Afghanistan. Out of our loyalty to the Russians in 1979, we did not condemn their misadventure. And today, Putin is merely doing business with Taliban. Now, there is also a very strong possibility that Taliban, to get rid of their surplus fighters, will like to sidestep them into the Srinagar Valley for doing jihad. And ISI will help them. Don't you think that it is a failure of our foreign policy that we may land up in this kind of a scenario? Thank you.
This is a very common question, but I honestly don't know how we can address it and how we could prevent it. I think we bet on a progressive Afghanistan, and I think we got the dividends from a progressive Afghanistan over the last 25 years. Suddenly switching horses, you'll be neither here nor there. As I said, you will be trading a bird in the hand for two in the enemy's bush. And on the question of Kashmir, actually the Taliban on their own, they have said so publicly, and on their own, I'm not sure they're terribly interested in making a push for Kashmir. The question is the whole range of other outfits that are Pakistan-based outfits who are in a relationship of, cooperation, call it dependence, in a fraternal relationship with them. They will definitely get offended. And the whole idea, at the end of 20 years of war on terror, when Al-Qaeda and ISIS were to some extent at least degraded or off balance, at the end of 20 years of war, with the triumph of the Taliban against, actually it is projected as against the United States, you will give a huge boost. The international terrorism will be back with a bang. And I am more concerned about the ripple effects of that in the region and beyond. And I think those old contacts and relationships. Relationships is the word I was looking for. Will become much more open now. They had been pushed back a little, but they will be revived. So I'm not at all sanguine that we could do anything about it. We are. And I think we tried to, look at the connection between extremism and democracy. And we hoped that democracy would be an antidote for extremism. Clearly, the way democracy was practiced in Afghanistan has not led to that. I think that is a failure. But I don't know how much we could have changed it. Frankly, we were not agents in Afghanistan. The United States and the Western coalition really ran and made the decisions for Afghanistan, not even the Afghan government. We tried our best to do whatever we can within that umbrella. And what we used that was to strengthen and develop and re-energize our people-to-people relationship, which you are right, which by backing the wrong horses at different times, we had lost. But we very quickly regained it. I can't tell you how popular many of our humanitarian and development and particularly our education projects have been in Afghanistan. But we are not on the back foot in terms of people. One Afghan parliamentarian told us in a gathering that India is in the hearts of the Afghan people. President Karzai used to say that $1 from India was worth $100 from the United States. Please don't be despondent about the place India has in Afghanistan, but we have to keep that. For that, we have to still continue that relationship. I heard the other day that an Afghan minister came to Delhi, diplomatic passport, not minister, member of parliament, came to Delhi from perhaps Istanbul on a diplomatic passport, and she was turned away from the airport. What is the message that we are conveying? That we don't recognize a diplomatic passport by a member of parliament when that government is still officially recognized in the United Nations. Perhaps it was just a human error. I think it was a human error. But, I think we should be very careful about these kinds of mistakes.
I'm calling in Padma Rao, who's a journalist. She has a couple of questions. Padma?
You said that one of the reasons that Afghans caved in when the US left was fatigue with war and unrest. But what about the 300,000 odd troops, Gautam, that were trained precisely for war, over the last 20 years? Why did the armed forces cave in? And the other question I had was, if the US and NATO were clear that they were in Afghanistan primarily to smoke out the Al-Qaeda, why did they get involved? I mean, because I'm hearing a certain amount of criticism in Germany, for instance, of their own government and the NATO involvement in other areas outside the purview of that original goal, like, art, development, trade, various forms of administration, if not governance. Yeah. Those would be the questions. Thank you.
Yeah. I think I basically answered this question right in the beginning in response to one of Nirupama's, but I will make a particular point on the army. Much is made about this 350,000 Afghan National Army, but the Americans only invested in the counterterrorism capacities of that army. And it was limited to basically a certain number and certain tens of thousands of Afghan special forces units who were trained and who acquitted themselves admirably in retaking urban targets that had been attacked. And even with some US air support, some cities like Kunduz and Ghazni, when they were actually, taken over, militarily taken over at some stage. But the Afghans, the Americans never invested in an Afghan national army. They didn't create an army that was capable of defending their borders, that was capable of holding territory. They didn't provide them artillery, armor, logistics, mobility, the engineering skills, the communication skills. What they did was of NATO standards, which required a battery of Western contractors and technical support, which could not be used. They could not even repair the aircraft that they are leaving behind. And it's very questionable whether that army was even 300,000, because we've all heard of desertions, we've heard of phantom rolls, payrolls. Who knows how many people were actually at the post when it happened. That, I think, coupled with the fact that, there was a very massive, I think the psychological war that was unleashed on the Afghan people through the Taliban, the information war that was unleashed, this will be a subject of military strategy for a long time. How people were morally defeated, mentally defeated before you actually took over territory. So I firstly disagree that the Americans really built up an Afghan national army. They built up probably as much or less numbers of special forces units as the Taliban. And the same special forces units, dependent on US air support, were having to go from city to city defending territory. I'm not saying all units were like that. The 215 Maiwand Corps in Lashkar Gah actually put up a very strong defense for Lashkar Gah, and it was one of the last to go. But by and large, this was the case. There were many other issues of military appointments, issues of Tajiks in Pashtun areas, Pashtuns in Tajik areas. And at some point, people start wondering, why am I fighting this war? Why am I going to die for another ethnicity? Things like that. But primarily, I would say that the Afghan state and the Afghan military was kept weak to three things. To essentially to be in line with the US war effort, which was a CT war. Second, because they didn't want to spend the money. It was nation building light, if you remember Rumsfeld's words. And third, out of sensitivity for Pakistan, and particularly Pakistan's use of ground lines of communication to ensure and insist that Afghanistan would not have a proper national army. And I can assure you, I'm willing to take a bet that even if the Taliban come to power in Afghanistan, Pakistanis will not permit a well-equipped Afghan national army.
Right. I'll call on Manikanta Sharma to ask their question.
Sir, I have one question followed by another. One is on trade and investment, regarding when the trade can be revived, because many of the Indian goods, we have trade relations. And the second thing is investments. We have invested a lot, nearly 400 billion in Afghanistan. With the China-Pak nexus, would it be a threat to India's investments in the future?
So can I just add to that question, Gautam? What is the fate of our, when we were denied this overland route for trade by Pakistan, we put all our eggs in the Chabahar basket. We built a road, that Dilaram-Ziranj road, and then we are partners in developing the Chabahar port in Iran, which will connect then to Ziranj on the Iranian border. So we thought this is how we are going to now do trade with Afghanistan. This is now, the port development is now infructuous, isn't it? Because in any case, if we don't have good relations with the Taliban, if we don't, they are not going to allow us to come in through Ziranj either, isn't it? So it's a bit infructuous, that Chabahar port.
No, I think we are actually prejudging things. Other than Chabahar, what other alternative did we have? If the Pakistanis were not allowing two-way transit trade, overland two-way transit trade, the only options that we are left were the air corridor and the Chabahar. Now, I think the government of India will have to take a view on that if it goes to such an extreme as to sever relations with Afghanistan. I think it's in our interest to keep the trade and the people-to-people relationship alive by whatever means possible. So, for example, even much of the trade that takes place now is coming out of the Pashtun areas of, dry fruits and fresh fruits and many other things. They are coming actually from all over, because you have hing coming from Mazar and you have other things coming from other places, also from Bamiyan. But a large majority of it, and that's why we used to have a number of flights from Kandahar as well. So I think we should be able to keep that relationship going. In response to your question, I must also refer to another question that I asked, another point that I made earlier, which was that it is going to be Pakistan's effort to prevent that. Because as I said, Pakistan would like to use geoeconomics to somehow reorient Afghanistan's trade, not towards Southeast Asia beyond Pakistan, but towards Central Asia and China. And our effort should be to, in fact, find strategies, ways and means to keep that trade going so that this historical trade and people-to-people relationship is kept going. Because otherwise we are just locked out of Afghanistan. In 1996, we severed our relations. Effectively for 5 years, we were locked out of Afghanistan. It happened to be that regime was extremely unpopular. So when it was ousted, we were able to come back, in strength. And I think something like that will happen once again. And also the Chabahar port is not only for Afghanistan. I think it is part of a larger strategic kind of connectivity project that we have, which is the International North-South Corridor, connects to Central Asia and even to Russia and eventually to Europe. So I don't think the Chabahar project should suffer on this count. And if it benefits trade in Afghanistan, I don't think at this moment we should be coming in the way of that.
So may I just butt in and ask a question, steal a question, as it were, right now, which is this a moment of great strategic confusion for India? Meaning, you have referred to this, and other people who have asked questions have referred to this, that India is completely cut out of the equation. We have very few options now. Our relations with Pakistan, on the one hand, we have a ceasefire on the LOC, which hasn't got converted into anything bigger or wider in terms of an engagement with Pakistan. Pakistan has got what it has wanted for the last 20 years. It has completely excluded us. We were completely excluded from any discussion on the future of Afghanistan that the US was having with other countries or Russia was having with other countries. So is this a moment, would you say that this is a moment of great strategic confusion at par with what India experienced perhaps the last time when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991? Is the confusion of that kind of severity? That is one. And the second question is, when there is a government in Kabul, is India going to recognize that government? What should India do actually?
So strategic confusion, you're absolutely right. This is a moment of great strategic confusion. I don't know if I mentioned it, but essentially an alignment that was Afghanistan, the West, US, India, the democratic world is being replaced by an alignment that is Taliban, Pakistan, China, and even Iran and Russia on the other side. And if you look at it, then we are completely locked out. And I did mention that, isolated. And so I did mention that, the Taliban will not be our strategic partner in such a scenario because it's already on the other side. And therefore, our strategic partner has to be the generation that we have, been partners with in the last 20 years. Whether it's of the severity of the collapse of the Soviet Union, I don't think so. Because while the United States standing will certainly go down, the United States, at least as far as we know, it's not likely to crumble or crack up in that sense in any way. But I think one very important point here is that we need to think whether our interests and US interests are convergent. They were never convergent in Afghanistan. As you know, one of the reasons why we actually also decided to keep out of those negotiations were that the Americans were pursuing solutions that we could never support. We were not in a position to be able to oppose them. And if we had tried to do that, people would have presented it as a spoilers kind of role. So I think we just kept our heads low and waited for a change in situation to be able to do whatever we could do, knowing full well that we have a certain political capital that we have acquired over a period of time. But yes, for the time being, I think we are outside. What is the way out? I think the way out is that, we should try to move a kind of reconciliation process, an inclusive process, take it out of Pakistan. Effectively, it is in Pakistan's hands now. And in some ways, I've been a little surprised by how passive we have been in the UN Security Council on Afghanistan. We hold the presidency for the moment. We have initiated a discussion under the formal agenda item on maritime security, but we actually waited for the Afghan foreign minister to ask us for a debate on Afghanistan. And what has come out are only press statements. I would have liked to think that, the one way that we can take this out of kind of Pakistani hands is to actually bring it to the United Nations, where we will be able to play a much stronger role. And also we could have perhaps used, I think it was too late by the time we had the presidency, but we could have used a period before that. There was a kind of international consensus against a military takeover, against an emirate, for a ceasefire, against violence. And I think we could have tried to cobble together something like a resolution, a UN Security Council resolution, to convey a message to the Taliban that if they want lifting of sanctions, if they want legitimacy, as it appeared that they did, then there are certain red lines that you cannot cross. But we were not able to, I think, take the ball as actively and aggressively as we could have and arguably should have, and actually convert something like a press statement into a much stronger resolution. So, even on the issue of trade and investment, we spent $3 billion in development aid, but we never considered the opportunity of actually building up an investment-based relationship. When we took the title for the Haji Kak iron ore mines, the thinking was that we will invest in mining in Afghanistan. That will generate revenues for the Afghan government. We could look at the possibility of at least some element of beneficiation in Afghanistan. If China wanted that iron ore, it could have been exported from Afghanistan instead of the iron ore that we export from India. We even explored opportunities to collaborate with China, when they would evacuate their copper, whether we could evacuate, these are at a very informal level, so it's not at a formal level at all. And then also consider what additional investments we could make, both in the livelihood sector of the real economy, which as well as in the mineral sector. But unfortunately, that was a one-off initiative at a moment when the Americans were drawing down, and it somehow did not catch momentum. But I think in many ways we missed an opportunity that when the olive fatigues of the Americans were leaving, if we could have brought in some investment, that would have helped the Afghan state.
I also asked you about the recognition to government of the Taliban.
That will depend on the shape of the government. If it's going to be a Taliban government taken over by force with very little inclusion, and where India has no chance of playing a role in Afghanistan, I think we should adopt a much more reserved position. I don't think we should feel pressured into recognition. We have actually built up a bit of an emotional relationship with Afghans and Afghanistan in the last 20 years. And I think we should preserve that by other means, not necessarily by recognizing the Taliban, which will be seen as a betrayal of the spirit of freedom and democracy and rights that we have supported all these years.
I'm calling the next person from the audience, who's Snehal Kaushik.
So my one question stems from the fact that there is one more terrorist group that we have, I think, put in the shadows, that is the ISIS, that has started to breed in the hilly areas of Afghanistan, which is bordering India as well. So, and we know for a fact that ISIS is more radical than the Taliban, and there is some infighting between them as well in Afghanistan. So what repercussions could you see being there for the region when then the Taliban, as and when it takes over? So with the ISIS, and how would it affect India or the region itself?
Okay, interesting question. I've always thought that the division between the ISIS and the Taliban has been too neat. This business about ISIS only attacking sectarian targets and the Taliban attacking military and civilian targets that, in some ways represented the Republic government, the Islamic Republic, was too neat. And in fact, scholars have documented links between the Lashkar-e-Taiba and the ISIS also. And as you know, the Lashkar-e-Taiba is very much in control in many ways, or at least dependent on the ISI of Pakistan. So this is an unknown factor, to be very frank. I think it's very likely that while the Americans were there, I think the ISIS-Al-Qaeda competition didn't come out too far openly. But there are also many people who view that ISIS is also another Pakistani horse in the Afghan game. Maybe not all elements of the ISIS, but at least some elements of the ISIS. At any rate, the effect of the ISIS, the ideology of the ISIS is, again, very kindred, more or less like the Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, except a much more nihilistic and much more violent. So I think with the US absence now, it's reasonable to expect that competition between the ISIS and the Taliban and perhaps even the Al-Qaeda will increase. The bases that they lost in Iraq and Syria may, in fact, actually they've already migrated from there, but may get strengthened. And to the extent that there are elements in the Taliban who would be disappointed who would have problems with, let's say, the mainstream leadership, the ISIS would become an alternative for them to join. So another brand is already available for those who would like to drop out of the Taliban or any other tanzim that is active there. So I do definitely see that there will be a problem there. But it's difficult to forecast exactly how it goes.
So Gautam, if I may butt in with a question of my own here. I'm sorry, I keep stealing from the audience. Is this a victory of militancy?
Yes.
I mean, is this a signal to militant groups everywhere that they can win? And what effect is that going to have within our own borders, say, for instance, in Kashmir? Is it going to embolden militants, not just in Afghanistan, Pakistan, but in places in Africa, in India? Won't it be seen as a victory for Islamic militants?
Yeah, in my view, yes. I think in the Kashmir Valley, for quite some time now, people have been both predicting and anticipating a Taliban victory in Afghanistan, and they were, in many ways, I think they were expecting that they would get, at least their ideology and their movement would get a boost with this. I definitely think that at the end of the 20-year war on terror, terror outfits have won. They have defeated a superpower. The lessons will definitely, this is going to be an inspirational kind of victory for many other radical outfits. It will have a demonstration effect. It will have ripple effects. I think fortunately in India, we have, largely insulated ourselves from very radical extremism. At least the numbers are not that very high. But we have seen expressions of support for a Taliban victory, even in India. But I think one thing that I would really like to warn here is that we should be very wary of portraying Afghans as somehow pro-Taliban, pro-extremist, or in fact, in some ways, communalizing this, the problem in Afghanistan. Because one thing we should not forget, that the Afghans are the friendliest country to India in our neighborhood. And that, if we compare the level of friendship that we have from Afghanistan, and let's say we have what some people like to think of as Hindu Nepal, there's almost no comparison. In fact, Afghans in many ways are our best friends in the region. So we should not see them from the prism of religion. Rather, we should see them from the prism of liberty and freedom and values that are closer to ours, and in fact welcome them at the moment when they are in their deepest distress. And I'm clarifying, we are not talking about long-term refugees. We are not talking about election cards and Aadhaar cards. This is temporary kind of asylum, and even perhaps asylum to help them get UN refugee status or third country resettlement. There are many sort of ways in which we could be helpful in this process.
So in that sense, if I just one more question from me is, we have been telling the world about terrorism, that there has to be one definition of terrorism, and there are terrorist groups, and we have campaigned in the United Nations Security Council across the world, with the US in Europe, for recognition of the kind of terrorism that we experience in India. Now with the Taliban about to form a government, let's assume that they're going to do that, and Pakistan very much in the driving seat, and the US kind of hands off with that, at least to all apparent purposes. How much of a hearing are we going to get in the world about our own problems with terrorist groups that come from across the border? How much receptivity is there going to be in the world to that?
Unfortunately, I think we have to prepare ourselves for the reality that in order to, get rid of the Afghan headache, people will look for a fig leaf of a transitional, inclusive government, and give the Taliban the legitimacy and perhaps even the recognition that they want. Though I hear that even now the Taliban have been quite defiant about the last date of withdrawal of US troops, because the US evacuation effort is also not yet complete. So I think, in effect, the world is going to give a pass to both Pakistan and Afghanistan, and in the process actually legitimize a group that has been, considered a terrorist group in the United Nations and elsewhere.
So do those designations, sorry to interrupt, do those designations under the UN Security Council, are they worth the paper that they are printed on? The designation?
No, effectively now it will be diluted for whatever it is worth, because once that happens, see, the international community still has those leverages for the time being. But my own feeling is that now, having taken over, they can easily ignore the kind of demands that have been made. Without the presence of the US military, they can simply, dismiss what leverage does the West have left. And on the contrary, they have, possibly they can turn to depend on China. China would use that to leverage its own interests, whether it is ETIM or the BRI or anyone else. So in effect, the Taliban Afghanistan will be thrown much more into Chinese hands as well. So as far as the overall effort at terrorism, I think, President Biden did list counterterrorism as a continuing priority. And I think basically what is the Taliban will be, the Taliban will be rehabilitated, but not necessarily all other groups that are international terrorists. Our job will be to try, basically the root cause of the problem has been Pakistan. All countries have given Pakistan a pass on this. We will have to continue together with the Afghans who are willing to continue to re-spotlight Pakistan's role in all this, as well as the role of Pakistan's support for these cross-border terrorist forces. So in fact, I would say that this is a time to actually renew our effort to highlight the Pakistani role in the current process. At least it should not be simply, forgotten by the wayside. I don't give us much success in doing this, but I think there's a virtue to even just keeping the agenda alive.
How do we stop the threats to India's internal security with upcoming of Taliban, not in a shorter run, in a longer run, with respect to maybe Jammu and Kashmir and Pak-occupied Kashmir for that matter, and maybe with respect to radical Islamic idealism. maybe with Islam and love jihad, such ideologies. So how do we make it up with India's internal security, and what are the threats?
Yeah.
What are the possible threats?
Yeah.
And
I think
second
you are
question,
asking me. Yeah.
which is on the
Go ahead.
what if China intervene in absence of US?
Intervenes in Afghanistan?
Invest with respect to the monetary funds, maybe the infrastructure projects, which is really very good at doing. So with these things, it will be a chaos around the Indian subcontinent with like Taliban and coming in power, and that is how it. What is the way forward into this?
Yeah, got it. Gautam.
Right. So, the question on internal security, I must confess, is a little beyond my competence. I don't feel comfortable answering that. The government claims that, of course, that it has a very strong counterinsurgency grid and that it will be able to manage the security challenges and threats certainly in Kashmir, or at least that's what they think and say. But I think many experts are really quite worried about the possible impact more widely inside India, particularly given the situation that we have with minorities and in particular Muslims being under pressure to prove their loyalty to India. So I think very much, this is something that could join at some point. The kind of minority baiting that is going in many parts of India, or certainly at least parts of North India, this kind of majoritarian agenda could join with this, enhanced kind of Islamic identity and, support for radicalism. But so far, I would still say that the body fabric of India, the body fabric of also Islam in India, is not oriented towards such radicalism. So I would very much hesitate to, at least to kind of demonize this as a threat that requires preemptive action. In fact, I think my solution would be that, we should return to the kind of traditional syncretism, tolerance, and coexistence that we had in order to, in fact, one of the remarkable things about this entire radicalism in Afghanistan is that despite India's very large population of Indian Muslims, there have been very few, even the few that have been there are a handful of people who have been involved in extremism or the radical struggle in Afghanistan. So I would say that we should just keep the temperature down on that. And what was the second question, Nirupama?
No, he asked about China, I think. China,
yes. So
China's involvement in Afghanistan,
Yeah.
what is the shape of that going to be?
Yeah, correct. So, actually China's involvement in Afghanistan is very modest. I think somebody told me that a figure of their investments in Afghanistan so far is just about 156 million, peanuts. And in fact, they haven't invested in any development projects. Actually, no country has invested in development projects like India has, not even the United States or any other country. I would say that the Chinese are certainly looking at, they're very tempted at, the strategic space that has been opened up, because in many ways it allows them two things. Firstly, it allows them to puncture the Central Asian mountains, cross Afghanistan, and tie up with their 400 billion 25-year geo-economic deal with Iran, which gives them actually direct land access to the Persian Gulf. And this deal also has strategic overtones. But the second thing is that in many ways, China may also be looking, because it's fond of redundancies, of this route as a kind of outlet from the kind of pressures that it is facing from the United States and the Quad in the Indo-Pacific. So I think there are definitely strategic temptations for China there. One major concern, and I think this will be a primary concern for them, is the ATIM factor and how they'll be able to handle the ATIM factor. If they try to address only the ATIM factor, the rest will still remain. The danger is that in order to address the ATIM factor, they may have to address a much larger group of radical extra organizations. which in effect will bring them in the same position as the United States has been for the last 20 years, and which will effectively lure them into the bear trap that I talked about. But at the same time, it is using soft diplomacy, COVID diplomacy, the model of China-Pakistan relations to try and get the Afghans onto their side. I think it offers the lure of investments in connectivity projects and all the money.
CPEC.
Yeah, I mean, it's again right now the Chinese have not said much. I would think that if it actually tries to step into actively, the Chinese simply don't understand tribalism. It takes us many years to understand, the kind of tribal, clan, kinship, and other sort of structures that sort of govern even political life in Afghanistan. The Chinese are very, very far from understanding that, though they have the help of the Pakistanis for the time being. They are likely to find more and more irritants with Pakistan cropping up as they put their foot into Afghanistan. So my guess here is that they will be tempted to step in. It's going to be a gamble between the United States and others trying to lure them in, and the Chinese tempted to step in. My guess is that at some point or the other, they will burn their fingers and perhaps recoil, and then once again leave Afghanistan in a mess. The alternative is that in trying to address the ATIM issue, it will have to get involved in a much larger issue of extremism and radicalism. And that will involve Pakistan, that will involve all those outfits, and really carry the risk of luring and sucking them into the extremist quagmire in Afghanistan. Bad news for Afghans, I'm sorry to say. But that is why I think we should proceed along the route that I was talking about. Try and decompress the threat of radicalism by actually working on a genuinely inclusive government, even at this late stage. Use whatever leverage we have in terms of legitimacy and sanctions and so on in the United Nations. Try and hold back that recognition as the international community, not India isolated as an individual. Though, as I said, for their own selfish reasons, and selfish diplomacy, dominates international diplomacy nowadays. All countries first, my country first. And I think in that narrow pursuit of narrow self-interest, the larger common weal and common interest is likely to be sacrificed.
So, we have really overshot our time here. We are 20 minutes past what we had planned. So I'm going to close the questions right here. There are many, many questions. I'm sure lots of, I have a long list of people with questions, but we are going to stop it here.
So my apologies.
No, it was you were really good, and you took, I'm really glad that you answered all questions in detail. It was a very enlightening and enriching session, Ambassador Mukhopadhaya. Thanks a lot for being with us this evening. And I'm just going to hand over to my colleague. Yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, for this wonderful, informative, extremely valuable conversation. Thoughtful, clear-headed, wide-ranging, just as what we would want Explained to be. To our audience, we have been running a series of reports on the situation in Afghanistan in the Indian Express. Please do read. Ambassador Mukhopadhaya wrote the first of a wonderful explanatory series, and I hope he will write many more pieces for us. Nirupama, thank you so much for helming this conversation tonight. You can read all of Nirupama's reporting and commentary in the paper and on our website, www.indianexpress.com. You can also follow Explained, as also the Indian Express, on social media, Facebook and Twitter. Thank you once again to our partners for this program, Yojana IAS and ICICI Bank. Thank you all very much. Thank you so much, Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, again. Good night.
योजना आईएएस शुरू कर रहा है साल 2022 और 23 यूपीएससी एग्जाम के लिए नए बैचेस हिंदी और इंग्लिश दोनों ही मीडियम में ऑनलाइन और ऑफलाइन क्लासेस के साथ। योजना आईएएस हाईली एक्सपीरियंस्ड फैकल्टी, इंटरैक्टिव ऑनलाइन क्लासेस, एसे राइटिंग, डाउट क्लासेस, मॉक टेस्ट जैसे फीचर्स के साथ आपके यूपीएससी तैयारी के लिए एक कंप्लीट पैकेज ऑफर करता है। सो व्हाट आर यू वेटिंग फॉर? गो टू आवर वेबसाइट एंड रजिस्टर योरसेल्फ नाउ।